Welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And we want to welcome back for the fourth time our guest, Constantine Sandis. As you all know, he's director of Lex Academic, visiting professor of philosophy at the University of Hertfordshire, and a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. His books include The Things We Do and Why We Do Them, Philosophy of Action, an Anthology, and Human Nature, and From Action to Ethics, a pluralistic approach to reasons and responsibility. And his newest book, out now, is co-authored with Danièle Moyal-Sharrock, is called Real Gender, a cis defense of trans realities. Constantine, thank you so much for coming on. It's a pleasure.
Thanks so much. I hadn't realized it was the fourth time, so I'm very grateful you're not bored of me yet.
Yeah, man, you're one of
I'm,
our OGs.
I'm always enjoy talking to you guys, so thank you both
Same
so
here.
much.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, so as we usually do, we're going to start with a passage from the book. So in the book, the author's right. The resulting view of trans people as deceivers is one that is frequently voiced explicitly and grounds anti-trans legislation. For example, the bathroom safety argument perpetuates the stereotype of the transgender individual as a sexual predator, suggesting that an individual who was thought to be male when born, but self-identifies as a girl and wants to use the girl's bathroom or locker room is really just a man or boy wanting to sexually assault women or girls. We detect an extreme or double whammy form of epistemic injustice, in that epistemic injustice consists not merely of distrusting someone by virtue of their belonging to a particular group, but of viewing untrustworthiness or deception as the assumed salient defining trait of that group and all the individuals belonging to it. We have called the definitional injustice to highlight the fact that trans individuals are defined as deceitful. I say therefore I am does not mean that saying I'm trans makes me trans, but it does mean I am entitled to be taken at my word. We should place equal trust in trans self-identification as we do in cis people's statements about their gender. Raising the bar higher through skeptical scenarios is a testimonial form of epistemic injustice. Let us end this chapter with the words of Alex Marzano-Lesnevich. It is difficult to explain to my cis loved ones, who often can't conceptualize what it feels like to be transgender, how unnerving and damaging it is to be in a system that doubts our identities. Trusting adults to know who they are is not a radical thought. There is always a temptation to believe that history moves toward progress, yet the situation for transgender people in many countries, including this one, grows increasingly precarious and violent. The simplest step might be the most important one. Trust us. Okay, so this is where I want to start the conversation. So two things here. So it's either, number one, obviously what we just defined in the chapter is that trans people are viewed as either murderers, deceivers, pretty much people who are knowingly manipulative, right? And then on the other hand, and this is the one I kind of want to focus on more because this seems to be the more prevalent one, and it's also the one that kind of pisses me off the most. So when people say things like trans people are delusional, I promise you they're misusing the term delusion. So let me just define that really quickly before we get into the conversation. So this is coming from a therapist. So something that is delusional is a belief, a strong conviction against all a sustainable and sustained strong conviction against all forms of evidence, meaning no matter what you present to the person, they stubbornly hold on to the belief. This happens in psychotic states like a schizophrenic disorder, a delusional disorder, whatever, right? So why we cannot logically and sort of epistemically classify a trans understanding of the person and the trans understanding of the world as delusional is because trans people don't actually believe themselves to be males in the physical sense. They don't look at themselves and think, I am in this body a male or I am in this body a female, right? So when we think about delusional beliefs, we think of something that, again, is so obviously untrue. Trans people are saying, I feel this particular way, which is, again, well, not again, but it's their feeling, because I'm going to get into it a little bit more. So it's a feeling, but it's not necessarily a fact of reality in the sense that it is a physical construct. So when people use the term delusion, they tend to misuse it and they say, well, trans people just actually think that they're, let's say, a trans woman, let's say, or a woman, let's call biological woman, thinks that she is biologically a man. That is actually not the fact. So that person does not think that they are biologically such and such a thing, because then they would not be getting gender corrective surgery. That doesn't make any sense. So it's like the whole argument of like, well, why can't you just believe you're a leprechaun? Well, the person who might believe they're a leprechaun actually physically thinks of themselves as a leprechaun, whereas the person who gets gender corrective surgery does not think of themselves that way. So I really want that to be clear, that the word delusion here is misused. Okay, now Constantine. So I actually again want to start with this topic. So can we get into our understanding, kind of like as a whole, our understanding, like sort of the layman's understanding and even misunderstanding of trans realities, number one, and number two, what are they really? What are we actually hearing from the people on the ground?
Thanks so much, Leon, and thanks for beginning with that and looking into delusion. First thing I should say, so you read this passage and it has the word we, and it's a shame that Danièle Moyal-Sharrock can't be with us today, but the book is co-authored. I can't speak for her, but I'm going to try. Everything I say will hopefully be things she agrees with. When I talk about the book, it's co-authored, but I may sometimes just say what I'm thinking. But I just wanted to sort of make that clear. Yeah, I mean, what you say is quite interesting because, I mean, I agree with your definition, what you say about delusion, but also more generally, the very fact that we have the word trans and the word cis, and that trans people like to use these words, want to use these words, says that yes, there's a difference. I'm not a cis man or woman, or I'm a trans man or woman. So that there's a difference between those two things. So there's no the delusion would be thinking I'm being a trans man and thinking I'm a cis man. That may be delusional, but it's there in the vocabulary. And what I find interesting is that many sort of anti-trans activists reject the word cis for themselves. They don't want to use the word cis. They want to just say I'm a man or I'm a woman. I don't. And I find that kind of problematic because they're the ones rejecting the very thing, the very distinction, conceptual distinction that proves that there's no delusion there. So I would go as far as to say it's delusional to not accept that you're a cis man or woman, for example. So that's kind of just to fit in with like an additional piece of evidence that people know exactly what it is they're talking about when they say I'm trans. And of course there's non-binary stuff and gender fluid stuff and so on within the trans umbrella. But biology can be a bit trickier. I mean, you mentioned the sort of gender affirming surgery for example, and that there can be cases so sometimes we speak in the book of sort of something akin to like native biology, so biology you were born with compared to what may happen to you biologically over time through choice or otherwise, and so on. So biology can be a little bit more complicated, but again, like you say, if you're going for gender affirming surgery, it's because you're not biologically as you want to be in certain respects, at least. There's no delusion there. A similar term that gets thrown about is dysphoria, which sort of turns it into a kind of, oh, you need curing from this. It's a kind of condition. It's maybe a mental illness of some kind. It's maybe tied to depression and so on. It's as far removed from happiness and euphoria as possible. And of course, anybody can have moments or long periods of sadness or uncertainty or thinking through things. But to talk of dysphoria in this way, as if it somehow captures what it is to be trans, is also problematic in a different way. So in a way, we've got three different things. We've got the sort of imposter stuff, delusional or dysphoric. So it looks like there's this kind of crossroads of, and it's like, oh, you're trans, so what are you? Are you like an imposter who's trying to abuse people or whatever, and you're just are you maybe a cheat in sports or whatever? That's the other one. Are you delusional, or are you dysphoric and in need of help? These seem to be the kind of labels. So like, okay, you're not an imposter, you're deluded, or you're not an imposter, you're just dysphoric, or all these negative kind of labels associated with it.
Yeah, and why do you think people struggle so much to accept their reality? Especially because, I mean, obviously, from what we see and what both of you note in the book is that people start to experience it from a young age, and for the most part, these beliefs are fairly stable over a lifetime.
That's right. And it's hard to know. I mean, I think it's not that you're wrong that people struggle to, like cis people struggle to accept this. But it's also kind of generalization. You know, one of the things we look at is trans or trans adjacent, people, before the concept of trans fully existed or had developed to what it is today in different cultures and different places at different times, going all the way back to ancient cultures. And not all cultures have had a problem with this. We even see cases where it's sort of thought to be in some way you're divine, or a kind of seer or something if you were trans, right? So there are these kind of things. So it's not that, I don't think it's that there's something kind of hardwired into all humans that to have a problem with these things. It's more that different societies conceptualize the world in certain ways. And I think a lot of people have trouble with change. Concepts. Part of what we do in this book is, we both have this kind of Wittgensteinian background, and language changes over time, and language develops. There are changes kind of on the ground. They don't have to be social political. They can be technological. They can be artistic. They can be kind of social in a wider sense. But there are changes. The world changes, and our concepts develop with them. They don't stay still. And so concepts like man and woman sort of change over time. But there are people who struggle with this kind of thing. And we have some analogies at some point in the book. I mean, the very concept of a book, you can have people who sort of say, oh, a PDF is not a book, or those kind of questions. And these concepts change over time, but you're going to sit there saying, oh, an audiobook's not a book because a book has to have pages. I mean, what are you even saying when you say that? And now imagine saying that and being like really angry about it and gung-ho that books must have at least so many pages and be like what would that be? So we look at that. We look at kind of vegan analogies with, people get very irate about, you can't call this cheese, you can't call this a sausage or whatever. So we look at things like that as well. But so one reason why some people might struggle is a more general sort of small c conservative views about how language is, and sort of thinking, oh, but, and one thing that's interesting is there are different things people might say. So people might zone in on one thing and say, if you have a penis, you're a man. But in other contexts, they might suddenly talk about testosterone levels and not particularly care if you have a penis or not, or talk about chromosomes and not particularly care. So depending on the context, different things seem to matter to people, and yet they might pick one of those things and focus on it as the defining sort of feature of something. And then I think there's a lot of this is, I think, more prevalent in the UK than the US. It might be a case of sort of thinking the grass is greener, but there are a lot of sort of powerful voices saying things that are, in a way, fake news of some kind, fear mongering, that stuff about being imposters and abusers. And it's not that it doesn't happen, but one thing we talk about in the book is people forge passports. That doesn't mean anyone with a passport is an imposter. So of course, and anything can be abused. Of course, no one is saying that there's no such thing as a man pretending to be a woman in order to get out. You know, these things can happen and they're very serious, but we've got to distinguish them from something that has absolutely nothing to do with this. And that's the kind of point about this. It's not to deny that there can be such things. If I can say one more, I've been talking for a while. If I say
Please.
one thing before I forget it, just to sort of not sort of put everything on one side of a debate that can be sort of pretty aggressive at times, and even worse. I mean, you know, we may be wrong about some things. We've done our best as cis people trying to understand trans realities. But one thing that's struck us is that there's one sort of subset of trans people and trans allies who do say things that sound like they're denying sex is real or biology is real. It's hard to know what percentage of people this is because it tends to be people who are more vocal on social media, for example. Now, this becomes a philosophical question, and maybe we're wrong about it. So we're not saying it's our way or the highway. But one thing we are trying to do in this book is say that, not to say that we're out to disprove people who think it's a social construction and are more with Judith Butler, for example, but to say that as far as we think through this philosophy, you don't have to deny these things to accept trans realities and be a trans ally, so that there can be such a thing as biological reality. It's a bit like what Leon began with, that you don't, and you may well be aware of that, and that leaves all the space trans people need for trans rights, and so on. So part of what we want to do is, you know, sometimes it can be a dog whistle. So you see people saying they deny biological reality, they deny sex. And if you think that's what it is to be trans or to be a trans ally, then of course you're going to think, oh, this is wrong. This is some weird ideology. I don't want to subscribe to this. So regardless of, you know, the complex truth of these matters, when you come down to looking more seriously into to what extent aspects of sex might be socially constructed and so on, we want to say you don't need to believe that to have everything a trans person wants in terms of rights and so on. Yeah, so I wanted to sort of say that as well.
Absolutely. And something that struck me while I was reading this is not something I mean, on maybe this was a peripheral thought, but like as I was reading the book and preparing for this podcast, something that struck me is the actual internal world of someone who is, you know, let's say a trans woman as an example, right? Either growing up as a child or how they really feel internally. It was interesting to me to actually be able to see that perspective from, you know, there were some examples of different people in the book, and how they felt growing up, like literally looking in the mirror and thinking, I'm a girl, right? My mother, my father, they're calling me a boy. They want me to get this kind of haircut. They want me to act in this sort of way. Oh, I can't wear, let's say, pink if I wanted to wear pink. I can't express myself the way I want. I feel incredibly limited, right? And even when I voice, my concern, even though it's incredibly hard to even be that vulnerable and express that, let's say, to your parents, the sheer fact that some parents denied that reality, denied maybe saying, no, 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 we're going to just keep repeating to you, no, 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 you're a boy.
Well, that's going to fix them.
Like as if that's going to fix them. Or just listening to their concerns, but not even empathizing, right? And something that, and there's different lanes, I suppose we could go with this, but at least in relation to maybe even prejudice, let's say, in terms of maybe those stories, right? Or not stories, rather, when people, let's say, voice concern, I would not want a trans woman in a female, let's say in a bathroom, right? And this paints them as sort of either sexual predators or deviants, or maybe somebody who might be aggressive, right? Now, before I read this, I the way I pretty much thought about it was, or I actually, let's put it this way, I actually didn't really even give that much thought to it. But then when you actually really, you know, um, really take a good complex look at this, a real nuanced look at this, like when you're putting those stories out there and the concerns that maybe people are having in the media, right? It's really painting like a whole group of people
Yeah.
as like you can't get away from the fact that you're being painted as a potential sexual predator, a potential deviant, potential aggressor, and it never talks about like who they are as actually as a person. Like even if there are stories that media has sensationalized where somebody was aggressive in a bathroom or something happened, some sort of sexual deviancy. Let's say the amount of those stories, it's like I believe in the book it was expressed it wasn't, first of all, there aren't that many stories of
Right.
that. And even when there were, it's discounting the idea of what about, let's say, females being aggressive towards other females in let's say in the restroom. Those aren't talked about, and you could easily find examples of that as well. And
Well, can I piggyback off of
oh,
that?
please,
Yeah,
please,
so
please.
this is my question for you, Constantine. So if we're taking all of that into consideration, right, and a trans person walks out of their home, and the constant understanding, in the back of their mind, this sort of repetitive understanding and thought is, well, I'm considered to be a threat wherever I go. What is that like for people?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks, Alan. I think Liam stole your question there at the end, but um, so I'm not trans, so I can't tell you. I don't have personal experience with this, but imagine what's that's like. One of the things we do in the book, because we don't want to speak on other people's behalf, is we quote a lot of from memoirs, from stories, from other people's books, and we did a lot of interviews as well of people telling us what that's like. And that sort of daily sort of fear of what will happen, who might react to you a certain way, who might and it's not a case of someone might accidentally misgender you and you correct them, and that can't be fun on a day-to-day basis if that's happening to you. But on the other hand, people who intentionally do it, so you're faced with that as well. And um, and then there's this sort of, does everything become about passing for example. There's we interviewed some people. There were these nice kind of stories of people who this kind of paradox of having um a gender stereotype about women being thrown onto a trans woman, and they're sort of happy they've passed, but on the other hand annoyed because a builder's whistled at them, or someone said ladies first, or something
Mhm.
that that makes them feel uncomfortable as a feminist, for example. So it's quite interesting, that kind of so you can also have these kind of weird experiences, these kind of tensions. You're about to meet Didi here, of sort of being semi-pleased and semi-annoyed at the same time. So there's this kind of and imagine that being your daily life. But then, these bathroom stories, for example, there's a number of things to say about that. One is, and it's happened in sports too, but the number of cis women who maybe don't look particularly feminine and have had other women or men tell them, "What are you doing in this bath?" So imagine you're
Wow.
like a cis woman and someone's telling you, "What are you doing there?" Because you happen to have, I don't know, strong arms or hairy arms, or your whatever, and something that people think is masculine or something, so they
Sure.
assume. So you have those kind of cases. And what one thing I sort of keep telling people is there's a reason why we hear a lot more about trans women for people protesting from against trans rights than about trans men, because no one, no one is sitting there when they're doing these bathroom things saying, so what about a post-gender affirming surgery trans man with a penis? Do you want them in the women's bathroom? It would seem so, and so there are, and it's the same, there are some trans men who are boxers, and there are questions, you want them boxing against cis women, for example. So there are those kind of cases. So it's not that there's like some easy answer to everything, but we have to begin from a place of, recognizing, um, like Alan was saying, the humanity in people, the whole person, and then moving from that to right. So something new has happened here. We have to start seeing what is the best way, with goodwill and good intentions to proceed, not just start shouting these things and being black and white about who gets to go where, to the point where cis women are being accused of all sorts because they don't meet certain gender stereotypes.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, let's just get into that, right? So now we can talk about the Olympics and what's going on with Olympic boxing at this point. And so I'd like in your, because I really want to focus on, especially what you guys wrote in your chapter about it, that you guys talk about the inequalities essentially fundamental in all of sports. And it's not just the issue of gender that comes up. I mean, height comes up, let's say more or less natural strength comes up, arm size or arm length comes up. So yeah, I mean, especially by the way, you see this in football where like some linemen have longer arms than others, et cetera, right? Okay, so can we talk about why you guys believe that the gender issue seems to be more prominent than any of the other ones? Why is it that we're hyper focused on gender within sports as an inequality, as a perceived inequality, as opposed to something again like height, weight, et cetera, et cetera? Or like why is it that this seems to be the one that stands out for some people?
Yeah, and that's a very good question, and I might not have the whole answer to it. I have some thoughts about it, but and inequality in sports is in itself something deeply interesting, I think, because on the one hand, you can't completely wipe inequality out of sports because there'd be no sport.
Right.
I mean, it would. On the other hand, we do all agree that there are inequalities in sport that are not good. They're not good for the sport. They're not good for the people participating, and so on. So there's this general, forgetting gender issues, there's a general interesting issue about inequality in sport. I'm quite short, so if I'm playing basketball, maybe I want like a short, I'm kind of joking, but like a short people's basketball league, maybe we'd have a better game, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in a way you might say, well, too bad, Constantine, you weren't built for that. Let the big boys play, and that's understandable too, because who wants to watch a bunch of people my height playing basketball? So there's those kind of things. Now, I think it's true that right now in the media, gender is obviously the thing that's with the Olympics, but even more generally has been the thing in relation to inequality in sport. But it's not to say that historically we haven't cared about inequality in sports beyond gender. So, we talk about weight categories, for example, in boxing, handicaps in golf. So there are these paradigms out there. And they're quite good because they pick on something that could also be used in relation to gender without focusing on whether you're trans or cis or even, so you find the relevant bit that's creating inequality in the sport. Then you ask, is this the kind of inequality we can live with, like height in basketball, or is this a different kind of inequality? Is it one that's creating issues in the sport? And then you say, well, what does it come down to? Maybe is it testosterone levels? Is it how heavy you are? And then there are ways of doing this. It's not easy, but it's not meant to be easy, but it's not this kind of or all or nothing thing. Now, I mean, one reason why it's in the news a lot is this kind of fear-mongering stuff, or sensationalist, as Alan was saying, stuff, and so on. Another is that we've seen something. I mean, it's been particularly exciting in the UK, that, for example, women's football now is like this really great thing that's been going on for a long time now, but it's really taken off. They're playing at like a superb level. The fans are getting into it. There's been no violence from fans compared to men's football. The games have been great. And so once you have that, you can see the fear of people saying, oh, they're now going to build a team with trans women, or something like that, and it will be men all over again. So the fact that women's sport has become so good, and that they've been given a proper chance and support, financially and otherwise, and still not enough financially, but that those movements, I guess, raise these gender issues more, more generally. And then, yeah, talking of the Olympics, I mean, this of course was after our book was out, but or at least published in the UK, you see these things where people immediately jump to assumptions, like Khelif, the Algerian boxer, and it turns out this is a cis woman, and then suddenly people say, oh, but the chromosomes, oh, but and it's difficult on Olympic committees and so on to immediately lay down the new law, because we're trying to figure things out. But that bigotry you see of people immediately calling someone, and this is what I was saying, it's not just trans people, calling this woman, this cis woman, a man, and so on, and all this kind of, and it's happened before with Chinese athletes, in the previous Olympics. It's happened with we talk about a Spanish athlete. It's happened to, you see this time and time again. It's not even that new.
Yeah, and what's so interesting is I remember when I was arguing about this with my friends about, I'm sure you know about the South Park episode on trans, where they had like a guy who was pretty much the Macho Man, Randy Savage, and he was winning all of these different competitions, whether it was like weightlifting or whatever. So obviously, in some ways, like, it's comical, right? I mean, South Park is supposed to be funny, but the interesting thing is when you actually look into the data, like, it's a complete moral panic. So at first, when I watched the episode years ago, right, I was like, well, this makes logical sense, like, obviously, I mean, if a person is a man and they look like the Macho Man, Randy Savage, I mean, obviously they're going to, defeat a bunch of dainty looking girls. But when you look into the actual data, and you mentioned, and you both touch on this in the book, is that when you look at the actual data and the actual competition, it's like kind of 50-50. Like, sometimes trans people win, sometimes they don't. Even with Imane Khelif, I mean, the understanding was that, like, sometimes she loses, sometimes she wins. Yes, because she's already won the gold, this is now going to become a thing. I mean, which is unquestionable at this point. But the point is to say, if you actually look into the details and look into the actual, again, the amount of times that, like, folks actually win, it's literally just like a regular person winning. So it's kind of interesting how, again, the data is clearly cherry picked and nobody's really focusing on that.
That's it. And there's so much hype and sensationalism that the data just gets lost, in any case. So publishing the data doesn't even seem to make a difference, because people just focus on this other, look what they look like, or that's what it seems to ultimately boil down to. And if you want equality in sports, think of, so what is it this person, as it happens, this person we were talking about is this woman, but suppose they weren't, suppose it was a trans woman. So what is it they have that's making it unequal? And if a cis woman had it, would that be acceptable or not? If not, then we need a new weight category, or we need some testosterone sort of rules, which are there, of course, and
Which are there, yeah.
that's what was leading the decisions. That's what was being tested upon. Are the chromosomes making a difference beyond the testosterone? If not, why are they being mentioned? Those are the kind of issues. So there may be cases where something that seems unequal has happened. And the question is, well, what was the defining feature, and would it matter whether the person was trans or cis, or is the main point to do with these other levels, or height or strength or whatever? In which case, let's have categories for that, or let's have rules for that and whatever, if that's what's making it unfair. It seems weird that the thing making it unfair is something to do with sex and gender per se.
Yeah, and what's so
yeah, sorry.
Yeah. No, and what's so interesting is that it's like the benchmark keeps getting moved. So when you look at testosterone testing, one can say, well, okay, well, what if we have people who, let's say, are on testosterone, let's say on puberty blockers, and then by the time they're of age for the sport, whatever time they're playing in, right? So these are people that haven't actually hit puberty, for a specific gender. What about them? And people would say, well, no, they still have testosterone left over, and we can't exactly test how much of it. So the point is to say what keeps happening is the benchmark keeps getting moved. So you have on the one side people who are more or less trying to problem solve, like you guys are, and you're saying, well, here are these different ideas that we could think about. Not necessarily that they're definitive, because it's kind of hard to, again, nothing is going to be perfect, and it's hard to figure out what's going to work best, especially without trying it. But then you also have the people on the other end who are like, that's not going to work. Okay, what about this? No, that's not going to work. Okay, what about this? No, that's not going to work either. And you're like, dude, like, okay, it clearly seems like you clearly don't care. So what you're essentially saying is, it's my job, not me personally, but it's my job to figure out like what could work, and you are the one who gets to decide whether or not that works for you. And then it all kind of seems unfair, because again, the goalpost keeps getting moved further and further. So then it's like, you all just want to give up.
That's it. And then you have people who that's exactly it. People who sort of say, oh, no, I never said trans people don't have rights. Of course they have rights. They're the human rights just like everyone else. But it's like, right, do they have the right to compete in any category or in the Olympics, for example, or is that sort of taken away from them? Or, so those kind of questions, sort of, the rights of the person who's a sports lover, who wants to excel in a sport, and so on, and finding a way to make space for that's equal. And like you say, at some point, well, we'll each be running in a category of one if we wanted perfect equality. And these rules aren't always perfect when we're trying to improve them and approximate them and so on. And there'll be different views. I have friends, with very strong views on whether, VAR is a good thing in football, I should say soccer for your viewers, or not, or whether the offside rule is good or not, or whatever. But these debates can happen without bigotry against a group of people or a certain minority of people, and that's when you start thinking, so what's this really about here?
Yeah, yeah. And then again, when you're thinking about, so I'm just gonna take the other perspective for like a second, just so we could kind of get into what comes up during these debates. So just now, I'm gonna focus on something that you said, right? So you're talking about the experiences and then people feeling othered. So people on the other end would say something like, well, okay, just give them their own category, right? Like, what's the big deal? Let's just have like trans version of Olympics of some Olympic sport, or have like a specific bathroom for trans people. So the problem with that is, if trans people are already other, right? Because now you're saying, you're pretty much arguing for segregation, right? So it's like, if we're doing that, why not? And please, I hope nobody fucking clickbaits that or uses this as like a clip or whatever. So it's kind of like saying like, oh, we should just segregate like schools in terms of race too. That doesn't make any sense, because where does the line end? So the problem here is that if we're saying like, hey, I care about trans rights, but I just want them over there, and I'm okay with them having their own category as long as they're not in my room, right? What that's essentially saying is that like, okay, this is not really going to end, because what we could do is we could kind of put everybody off on an island somewhere, and then these people will never have any sort of or be a part of any sort of competition, won't be integrated into society, etc. So these are essentially the arguments that we had against something like discriminatory busing and discriminatory schooling. Like, I don't understand how people don't see this as virtually the same exact thing. Well, they'll say, oh well, yeah, we shouldn't segregate the races, but we should segregate trans people.
It's completely regressive. And someone, I wish I could remember the name, has looked into like really early press, kind of fear-mongering press, of about, when people started coming out more openly about being gay, so you get these articles on men saying they don't want gay men in their bathrooms, for example. So
Right.
now we have this version of sort of anti-trans activism that seems to pretend to be defending um, gay men and lesbians and so on. But you look at their arguments and they seem so similar to there was one of these articles, this kind of straight woman not wanting a lesbian woman in the changing room with her because she feels she's being looked
Right,
at.
right.
So you see, so it's the same. These people who wanted basically segregated changing rooms um for lesbians and gay men and bathrooms and so on, and it's the same thing. And now it's come back as partly in defense of gay people in some through some bizarre argument. But like you see that, and like what is that? This kind of othering of, oh, you're into men, I don't want you in my in the same bathroom as me, um or whatever. And what you're going to do with the bisexual people, and what you're going to do with, I get we're going to have like, one bathroom per person at the end.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And sorry, if you want to still say something on this topic, I do.
No, go move on. Yeah.
Okay, great. So one of the other things that sort of struck me as I was reading the book, and something I didn't really think about before, but I've started to think about this recently. So a hot button topic, right, is children and either receiving gender affirming surgeries, different hormones, whether it be estrogen or testosterone, puberty blockers,
Yeah.
that sort of thing. Now, before reading, something that used to make some sense to me was okay, right? If it's a lot of parents argue, the child is not old enough to make their own decisions yet, so allowing a child to have that sort of autonomy, that ability to decide their gender and to receive either the surgery, hormones, or puberty blockers at an early age. What if at a later point they change their minds, or what if they're just making that decision now but they'll change their mind later, but then they'll be left biologically different, that sort of thing. But actually, a thought that occurred to me recently was, one second, how many people who are trans maybe look back at their childhood, and I understand this is hindsight, you could argue also what I'm saying, but say they look back and they're saying, I really wish that during my childhood I would have been able to express myself as I truly authentically feel I am in my core identity, right? They would have had a more fulfilling childhood, being able to live the spring, that springtime of their life, living as they truly are, right? Maybe they would have had different sorts of relationships with people. Maybe they wouldn't have stayed hidden, perhaps, if that was a factor in that particular individual's life. And when I think of it that way, then you start to really appreciate, oh, how do you know that maybe these fears about what can happen in the future, um by dealing with what's happening now, like addressing that issue of somebody not feeling congruent, or not feeling that they look or are treated congruently with how they authentically feel. Um like it started to pull me in a different way of thinking. Let's put it that way. So I guess the question I want to sort of articulate is, what are the misconceptions that people have, or what have you noticed people think when it comes to children and receiving either these gender affirming surgeries, hormones, or puberty blockers?
And can I just really quickly add to that?
Please.
And the fact that for some people that's akin to child abuse.
Yeah, that's an interesting addition there
Mhm.
at the thanks. So we've got a sort of chapter on
Yeah.
children. So we looked into this quite deeply. Um, it's one thing to say about this is saying, oh, you should support your children doesn't mean that we think this is some kind of light matter and so on. But there's a real difference between saying, and again, it's a bit like the sport in this respect. There's a real difference between sitting down and sort of thinking through, well, what exactly are the precautions and tests and questions and what's the process before a child is allowed to go ahead with, say, hormones and whatever.
Sure.
And have we got the right sort of things implemented there to make sure that someone isn't doing it on a whim or because their best friend did it, or and these things can happen. So it's not to sort of just say, oh, your child said this, it's like it wants an ice cream, go get it an ice cream or something, right? So
Yeah.
of course there are serious things there, but to move from that to it's all insane, it's all child abuse, it's all ideology, it's all there's like a huge gulf between these two sort of things. And of course, the fear is that it's irreversible, which it often isn't. But but that's that fear. And people do sometimes detransition, and it's rare. It's very rare, but it does happen, and it's important to look at those cases and sort of see, again, you can't get everything right all the time, but to sort of see were there signs there? What was the process that allowed the transition to happen? Was it tight enough? There can be other reasons for detransitioning. Some people just can't take the day-to-day life of being trans out there, even though they still feel it and might detransition for kind of pragmatic reasons, in a way. So there are all these kind of things to look out for. But yeah, so in what Alan was saying earlier about looking back and thinking what my childhood could have been like. So Sophie Grace Chappell in Transfigured, which is kind of part memoir, talks about basically growing up in this closet about who they really were. And it's sort of it's heartbreaking to read these kind of stories. So tied to something I think Alan mentioned earlier that I didn't um fully respond to. So this sort of thing of when a child sort of looks in the mirror and says, I'm a boy or I'm a girl, so we talked about so initially when we were sort of first giving presentations of draft material and we were initially we thought, and looking at interviews with children and so on, we could see that there was this sort of very kind of fundamental certainty from a very early age that you can see in a lot of memoirs. Some people call it a feeling, some people call it knowledge, some people call it certainty, and within philosophy these things are very, very different. But lay people talking, are just, they don't mean something very specific necessarily. But we sort of like this idea. So there's this distinction between knowledge and certainty in Wittgenstein, where knowledge is based on sort of evidence of some kind, and certainty, bedrock certainty, is something that's not premised on something else. You don't say how do you know your name is Alan, or something? How do you know who you are when you wake up? How do you know you're a man? That like And that seems to be, and something that cis people have too, that there's a kind of certainty. I don't know it. I'm certain this is something sort of fundamental. And we call it
Self-evident.
you can people talk that way. The philosophical discussion gets complicated because that sounds like a kind of evidence. It's just self-evidence. There are little things that we may have different views on. Is that the right expression or not? And so initially we were sort of looking at a lot of things children say or adults said about what they felt when they were children. It looked like, yeah, whether this is self-evident or is certain or is something that they had zero doubt about. That doubt seemed to be sort of absent. So it wasn't like knowledge where there's a kind of possibility of doubt. And doubt seemed to be sort of absent. And so we were going along with this kind of certainty. And then some trans people rightly told us, look, there can be a lot of uncertainty in being trans, especially if you're sort of gender fluid or you're you know, and before the concept was fully formed and so on. So there can be uncertainties when you're thinking of transitioning and so on. But one thing we realized is that the people who felt those kind of uncertainties were nonetheless certain that they weren't cis. They were different in this way. So we talk of like a negative certainty as well. So some people might have a kind of positive certainty from a very young age that I'm a boy or a girl, and some might not. Maybe it's more confusing because of what they've been told about what a boy is and a girl, and or for whatever other reason. And there might be a kind of uncertainty there, and yet they know they're not like other boys or girls in some respects. So there's still something that they're sort of sure about, and it's trying to work with these certainties and then see. So it's not about, you know, just give kids whatever surgery they ask for or whatever. You know, I guess you begin with pronouns and you begin with you know whatever you know, however they want to present and so on and so forth. And then you see and you work through these things with them and medical professionals and so on. But this idea of ruling it out as abuse or something, arguably it's abuse to not let them live as they want to live, which I was part of Alan's point, I think. I don't want to put words in your mouth. Maybe you didn't say abuse, but
No,
you
for sure. No, for sure. It's even mentioned in the book. Like there are people who, you know, when they aren't allowed to express themselves as they wish, they'll have suicidal ideation, depression,
know.
uh, that sort of thing. And then by actually, and here's the thing, you both make the point in the book that of course there are cases where, you know, someone's identity can be a little bit more ambiguous, and they don't directly, you know, identify like, okay, no, I am a girl, I am a boy, that sort of thing. And maybe, you know, in certain cases like that, maybe someone with that sort of ambiguous sense of identity, or at least it is not, you may not necessarily consider certain gender affirming either surgery, hormones, and so on. So, um, but for those that do identify that way and their core identity, that have been able to have those kinds of surgeries, that's sort of either suicidal ideation, depression, um, um, isolation, that goes away. I think there was an anecdote of um, a child and their mother, and forgive me, I'm forgetting some of the details there, but there was where the child would keep talking about their gender, that I feel like if I'm, yeah, I'm probably getting this wrong, but I can't remember if it was it was uh,
Boy or girl?
a boy or girl.
No.
That's the thing. But like, oh, I feel like a girl, right? And the parent would be like, ah, let's stop talking about gender. You know, we could talk about something else, that sort of thing, just kind of avoiding the subject. But then when the child was actually able to express themselves, they were able to talk about other things, maybe the other things they're curious about, some things in nature, science, and so on, that sort of thing. And that's good, right? Because then you know, once they're allowed to express it, they could start to think about, you know, putting mental resources other places instead of somewhere where, you know, they feel limited and not, you know, depressed or isolated and so on. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
As if gender is your whole being or or something like that.
Right. I mean, yeah, at least when it's denied, or at least when it's not acknowledged, and then that's how that would seem, that it's
Kind of
their
built
whole.
up, and then that's all they can focus on
Yeah.
at that.
Right. Well, and then so because I would really want to drill this point home, because I'm sure Constantine, you would want all of this information available. Okay, so the author's right here. When detransitioning does happen, we must keep in mind that it is not always due to regret. In fact, the vast majority of trans people who opt to detransition do so because of external factors and not because of changes in gender identity. Super important. Many detransition as a result of social and/or familial pressure, religious conviction, or surgery complications. Some detransition on a temporary basis, e.g., in order to have a child, or for financial or familial reasons, or because they are unable to find a job or housing. And some do so because the rejection and stigma they experience as a trans person prove for them to be unbearable. Yet, in spite of such understandable reasons for detransitioning, only a small fraction of trans people choose that path. So again, this is super interesting because again, the people tend to harp on detransitioners, but they don't even think about all the nuance within detransitioning. So it's not as though like, okay, well, people detransition just because they don't feel that way anymore. They're like, I'm not this gender. No, within that, there's a small subset, an even smaller subsection of this subsection of people who are like, oh, okay, well, I made a mistake. So it's so interesting when you actually start looking at the data. It's like, when we actually start looking at, let's say, again, how many people end up, let's say, becoming sexual assaulters and let's say in women's locker rooms as trans men, right? So when you, and again, how many people win these competitions on average, right? So when we start looking at the data, it's so interesting what a distinct picture it places and it paints as opposed to like what we actually see or what we hear about on the news, social media, whatever. So now, Constantine, I guess this is going to be the big question, right? Because people can look at that argument and they could say, well, okay, fine, I'll give you the data argument, right? But even if there's one person who sexually assaulted somebody, right? Shouldn't we then take that into consideration just as seriously as the person who wants to use a particular bathroom?
Thanks. It's that's really interesting because you can always find the one person,
Yeah,
or a handful of people. You can always find, Mexicans for Trump,
right.
or
Mhm.
in the UK, the Conservative Party was very good having MPs who were anti-migration children of migrants, right? So you can always find that person who where in terms of like identity politics, there seems to be something weird going on. You can always find the the one person who's trans but kind of sides on the anti-trans activist rights for some
Caitlyn
bizarre
Jenner.
reason.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's always there'll always be, or the person who detransitions for a re and now in terms of like of course violence in prisons is a serious issue. Of course violence in bathrooms is a serious issue. But part of the problem is it's taking away from the fact that most in bathrooms most of this violence is and on the streets is happening from cis men, so it takes away from that and suddenly makes it as if trans women are the real problem. But the other thing is that, and this can be, I get it that this, especially in the media, can be really hard to uncouple, but there's a difference between being a trans woman and pretending to be a trans woman. Like,
Right.
so does this mean that no actual trans woman has ever been violent? Well, no, no actual any type of person has never been violent. But if you look at those statistics, and then the real question becomes, okay, well, how do we distinguish um, a trans woman from someone pretending to be a trans woman? And
Mhm.
and that's where things start getting heated up, because if the view is, well, anyone who says I'm trans is trans, then we have a problem. So there's got to be more to it than that. And the criteria start getting difficult, but it's a little bit like faking your CV, which does happen. And we've had vice chancellors in universities faking CVs, but how do you tell a CV is fake? Well, you can't do it in 5 minutes. In some of these cases, it took years and years to realize. Same with passports and so on. So the fact that someone can fake it, and that it's not easy to discern the fake. I mean, there's been paintings. I used to work on sort of fakes in art a bit. So paintings hanging in the Louvre for decades that turned out to be fakes, that experts had, paintings that experts from like Christie's had authenticated.
Wow.
And very interesting cases where what would happen is someone would buy the original with a certificate, they'd then forge it, and then what they'd do is they'd sell the forgery with a certificate of the original. So then they'd have an original without a certificate and a forgery. I'm digressing, but what the point is that it can be incredibly difficult to discern these things. Does that mean there's no difference? No. Even when the Christie's expert has been fooled, it doesn't mean, there's a number of these paintings out there and only one of them is an original. So of course people can fake this stuff, and of course it's not immediately apparent, who is faking it and who is not. And of course this violence needs to be taken seriously. But if you immediately just start saying trans women are violent, and that's not really the view. The view that comes out of it really is they're all fakes.
Right.
Well, that's not the case.
Yeah, because a lot of this stuff, it makes for comedy. Because Rogan had a joke recently on this special where he said something like, he made the joke about being, where he said, I identify as a woman to like a TSA agent, and she couldn't like say anything in return. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of comical, and you can kind of get it from some perspective where obviously like the regular person isn't just going to challenge you if you identify as something. But the point that I think you both are making in the book is that that's not really what trans people do. They don't look like Joe Rogan and say, oh, well, I decided to one day identify as a woman. That's again, it's like it's comical, and it's what's the word, it's sensational, yes, and it makes for interesting comedy to some people, but the point is to say that that's not what we're seeing in the everyday world. So it's like what we take as like, let's say, absurdity or whatever, or the reduction to absurdity, right, is sometimes taken as reality.
No, I think that's right. And here, this is kind of my own preference rather than Danielle's. I'm even a little bit sort of hesitant. I think this language is out there now, and I can see why it's out there, and it does support trans people. But I would rather, we move to I am a woman rather than I identify as a trans woman. I am a trans woman. I think that word identify, as I can see why it's there. It's played an important role, but long term, I actually think it should be ditched because it's creating it's making it seem as if so you're not really this thing, you're just identifying as this thing.
Uh-huh.
And I think that can, I see why it's there, and there are good pragmatic reasons why that was initially there in certain places. But I think in a way it confuses the issue because going back to an earlier question about why are people confused about this is they see a word like identify as, and they say, right, so you're not a woman, you just identify as a woman.
Right.
So what's that? I can identify as what, and then these jokes come in.
Yeah, the teapot, the leprechaun, whatever,
Teapot, the
right?
leprechaun, Cleopatra, blah,
Mm-hmm.
blah, blah, blah. And it's
Yeah.
so there are kind of interesting questions around that. And as you know from history of race and so on, language, this language will keep developing, and things that were okay to say before might not be okay. Think and vice versa, and things change, and that's just how the world works and how language works. But some of these terms I think do have some downsides to them, in that they create this sort of distance or this gap or this feeling, so people who don't quite get it start thinking, oh, so it's just about, and if you're not au fait with language, you might think identify as is a bit like identify with, and what is it to identify with something? Well, that's not to be it, and then you get all this kind of stuff. So in a way, saying I am a woman, happen to be a trans woman, I think is more direct, more to the point, and emphasizes that this is identity, not identifying as, if that makes sense.
Right.
For sure. Makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And so one of the more interesting parts of the book to me, and this will be the one of the final things we started to, as we start to wrap up, talk about, which is actually interesting because it's a more complex one. So the biological aspects of it. So, there's this obviously dichotomy, controversy, whatever, where some people would say, well, there's a difference between sex and gender. Other people will say it's the same thing. And then, as you guys write, it's actually way more complicated than that. It's not necessarily the same thing, but it's not necessarily different either. So can we talk a little bit about the biology? So how you guys describe dispositions, right? What we think some of those might actually be, those genetic predispositions, how the culture influences them, and how we kind of create, or maybe not even create is the right term, but how we kind of come up with what is or what we would describe as gender. Because again, it's not as simple as just I'm either born this way or it's just socially constructed.
That's right. It's not that simple, and that's not unique to gender or trans. The history of the nature nurture debate, goes back centuries, and you've always had extreme positions, like B.F. Skinner, give me anyone, I can make
Right.
anything, blah blah blah, or people, on the other side, kind of, I don't know, Nietzsche comes to mind, who think everything is like deeply innate. There's nothing you can do about it. It's all there from the start, and so those kind of, and of course the difficult, it's easy for me and Danièle to sort of say, well, it's neither all nurture or neither all nature. For the difficulty is in how these things come together. But at the very least, one has to sort of begin, I think, with saying, look, there are these two things, and it's not going to be 100% environment or social construct or 100% biology. Now, we do think there's a difference between sex and gender, but that's not to say that gender concepts have evolved independently of sex concepts, and it's not to say that sex concepts and the stereotypes related to them are completely independent from gender. But one thing we don't really talk about much about in the book, but I have a lot of animals in the house, and when you have something, and I mean domestic animals, it's even not that, you know, maybe at a stretch, people start buying, I don't know, blue collars for their dogs or whatever. But like, the wilder you go, the more you get to something that starts to look like pure biology without gender, right? But the point is, when I go to the vet, it does matter if my dog is being spayed or neutered, right? So that's the bit where we want to say, well, of course, there's such a thing as biology, and in those moments, at least, that gender seems to have nothing to do with it. We seem to be mainly interested in, now I say seems because, on the periphery there might be gender related things about the way we, to use a sort of pejorative, take a term like bitch and its relation to things. So it's not like it's completely unrelated, or that people don't have like gender perceptions about non-human animals and so on. But there's a sense in which when I'm at the vet and so on, biology is mattering there, and there's no reason why human animals should be 100% different from other animals on this, as if there's no biological basis. So, that then the question becomes, oh, but doesn't that make you anti-trans? You're just saying it's like, well, no, no one has, there's no reason why the rights of a certain group of people should in any way be suppressed because of what turns out to be biological fact or not. But B, as we know with humans, because we're social and cultured creatures in a far more radical way than other non-human animals. It's not to say they don't have their cultures and so on in some cases, but their gender and sex start to influence one another in terms of stereotypes and so on. And to go back to earlier questions, yeah, there can be a case where, hey, it's okay to wear pink and still be a boy. You don't need to transition because you like pink, or because you're sexually attracted to men or whatever. Those aren't reasons to think you're a woman, right? But there may be other things. And then we were sort of in the chapter on children, we were starting to see these things happening from these feelings or certainties from a very early age. And Leon mentioned, is it born this way? And it's not quite that, but that debate is there for gay people as well. And there'll be, in a way, sometimes some gay people will say, I was born this way, and who am I to say, no, you weren't, it's all social or whatever. So in some way, I feel like stepping back and saying, look, some people feel it's more social, some people feel differently. But it seemed to us like on a more general sort of level, sort of beyond gender, that it makes sense that there are these innate dispositions, and whether or not they get triggered in a certain environment, or the way in which they get triggered, can depend on other things. And in a way that has to be true, because concepts are different in different cultures. We carve up the world in different ways. We can imagine radically different cultures where gender just isn't the way, never was binary. We have this culture where actually it wasn't always binary, but it was binary for some centuries, and then there's a move away from that, and people have trouble accepting it and so on. But how the biology and the environment are going to relate will depend in what is the environment like, what are the gender concepts like in this, what are the expectations, what are the stereotypes. So so it can't be biology all the way down. But we also don't think it's all a social construct. Now, there's a sense in which there's no concepts are in a way constructs, they're human things. So there's a sense in which, of course, the concept of sex involves social construct just like any other concept, but that's not, we mustn't confuse the concept of biological sex with biological sex itself. So you've got the thing, then the concept of the thing, then you've got the word. So, and it's not that we're here saying, science is going to develop, keeps developing biology. It's not that we're here with, here's the formula, here's the equation. Now we know exactly how much of it is environment or nurture, and how much of it is nature. But it seemed to us, and part of what we were doing is you don't need to deny um, biological reality to have the other stuff. So I don't know if that fully answered you.
Yeah, well, so there are two things I want to say. So the first thing I would say is I love the way you guys frame it in terms of actual predispositions and preferences and tendencies. So the way that you frame it is that some are stronger than others, some are weaker than others, and then you have an environment with the pressures and the stimuli, etc., that sort of activates them in a way. So where if, let's say, somebody has more or less a predisposition to, I'm just going to pick something stupid. Let's say they like toy cars, right? Let's say it's a girl and she likes toy cars, right? And then sort of the environmental pressures will kind of help her enact that, right? Whether they still kind of help her suppress it and say, well, this is not for you, or whether they help stimulate it and say, no, it's okay. You can kind of be whatever you want, or whatever works for you kind of works for us, right? So I like the way that you're framing it, is it kind of gives a dimensional aspect to it, where pretty much it's not to say that we specifically have one set of preferences over, or it's not that we have specifically one set of preferences as opposed to the other. We might have preferences that maybe sort of, again, are stronger than other preferences, but we have like a dimensionality of preferences, which again sort of more or less fluctuate or change based on environmental stimuli. I love that. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is, and this is going to be one of the last ones as we wrap up, is if for anybody who's ever studied evolution, so what people don't seem to understand is that, like, when you're like in fifth, sixth grade or whatever, like you see that chart and it's like, here is a lizard, right? And here's how the lizard evolves into man, right? And we would say, well, naturally, right, speciation makes a lot of sense. We could say this is a lizard, this is a man, yada yada, and these are all of the differences in between, right? People don't seem to really get, once you study evolution, speciation is really complicated in nature. So once you actually look at the details of evolution, and once you look at, again, the dimensionality of it, right, you see that it's actually really, really hard once you get into the weeds of it to differentiate between one species as opposed to the other. Like, yes, once we see let's say, if you want to call it the final product, and you could say, well, this is a chimp, this is a man, right? And they evolved from an X ape, right? Whatever. So, but the point is to say that it's easy for us to say that with these charts that literally just map differences and the end point of these differences. But again, when you actually get into nature, and this is why I hate the biological argument from people on the right, because they don't seem to fucking understand biology, is when you get into nature and when you start looking at speciation, it's actually incredibly difficult, especially when you look at evolution. It's incredibly difficult to differentiate and say, well, this is where this species ends and this is where this species begins, because again, this is done over time and the evolution happens over time. So if we were to accept that evolution is actually this big transitional process, then we could see that, oh, okay, differences in nature and our inability to even really understand them and to grasp the nuances in those differences actually makes a lot of sense.
Thanks. I'm not sure what to add to that, but yeah, I mean, it's like so many other things these days. Everyone thinks they're an expert in whatever for 10 minutes. And this stuff is hard, and we don't pretend to have some kind of the correct answer. But what do we know? We know that some people realize very late in life that they're gay. It's not that they were in a closet. It's not that, the explanations for why it took this much time are as varied as the number of people. But also in some cases, is it realization, or is it that they're gay now and they weren't before, right? And why should we not allow for that? Why must it be, oh, you must have always been this, you just didn't know it, you were self-deceived? You think things change, things trigger other things. And so there's a philosopher who I'm incredibly fond of, even though he's in so many ways as far removed from my sort of Wittgensteinian sort of general approach, who he's not with us anymore, but Fred Dretske, really important philosopher of epistemologist, but also mind and action and language. And he talks of structuring and triggering causes. So that was one of the things that kind of influenced me here, and that there's the thing that happens to trigger a particular, say, behavioral response or change of mind, or so. And Leon, in the past, we've talked about an particular teacher that and sort of exchanges that triggered a sort of path for you.
Mm.
And then there's the structuring cause, which is how things have to be for that event to trigger what it does. So that same person could have said the same things to you, but if you were structured differently, or even if your environment was structured differently, those same words would have not done what they did. And this is part of one way of sort of understanding the dispositional stuff and the nature nurture stuff, and even some of the evolution stuff. So so you've got these things that are kind of structural, and then you've got these things. So in the evolutionary case, you've got these things these large events that trigger stuff, earthquakes, volcanoes, whatever, and then they interact with structure, and then you get whatever happens to survive and what it's like, and so on. So that was part of the way I was thinking through this with Danièle, was this kind of again, when we go into the details, exactly what counts as structure and trigger and so on can be quite complicated. But that was part of the sort of idea with the dispositional stuff, that same trigger wouldn't work on a differently structured person, or even a differently structured environment. So it's not like, right, so which is it? Have you always been this? Which, but that doesn't mean that there might not have been something in the biology that enabled this. And of course, these things are very high. How do you verify or falsify these things? If I sit there and can I say, oh, there's nothing in my biology, there's nothing, if I lived for 20,000 years, there's nothing that would ever make me gay or trans? Like, how can I know this, right? Like, how you can, so if I say I'm a straight cis man, what does that mean? Well, it means like, well, this is what I am, as far as I'm talking to you right now. But you can sit there and say other things with whatever confidence you like, but what do we know?
Right. I love that. And I appreciate mostly the open-mindedness of all of this. And we're pretty much going wherever the science is taking us. Okay, Alan, final questions for Constantine before we wrap up.
Oh yeah, of course. So if we wanted to, follow you, follow your work, and of course buy the book, where can we do
Don't follow me.
that?
Buy the book. The book I've been trying to get a lot of in the UK. I've been trying to get independent bookshops to stock the book so that people don't necessarily have to go to other retailers. I'm a little more removed from that in the US, but I believe that most big bookshops have that available online. You can go straight to Polity or Blackwell as well.
Mhm.
And there is that other famous web place where people buy things. I'm sure you can get it and there as well. Um, yeah, that's in terms of purchasing, whether you go direct to the publisher or a bookshop or another online retailer. These things always strike me as I'm pretty sure you can get it in Walmart, but I don't know what that means. Does that just mean you put an order in online and then Walmart go and get like I don't know why someone would want to do that, but yeah those things. Do you know that Colm Tobin, the Irish writer, he's got this. He plugged his whole book by going down to some Walmart and finding it in the warehouse. And anyhow, I've digressed. I am
Yeah.
on what's now called X, but I'm not there as frequently as before. I'm C Sandis in most places.
Mhm.
I tried Blue Sky for a bit, but not that much was happening. I'm on there. Um, I'm on Instagram. I'm everywhere and nowhere. Uh,
All right, Constantine, thank you so much, man. This was like a
It was a
phenomenal
pleasure.
episode. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for the wonderful questions.
All right, that was great. So, everyone, if you would like to follow us, you could follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram. On X, we're at Seize underscore podcast. Like, subscribe,
Hit
hit
the
the
bell
bell
on
on YouTube.
YouTube.
And again, thank you so much for watching and see you next time.